حضورنا الكرام، نود تذكيركم بأن اللغة الرسمية للمؤتمر هي اللغة الإنجليزية، لذا يمكنكم الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية عبر أجهزة الترجمة. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. It is the fifth day of the IAEE 44th International Conference here in the heart of Saudi Arabia, where energy has a home. I'm your MC, Rana Al-Hanaya. Your safety matters to us, so kindly keep these simple directions in mind. We are not planning any drills. Should an incident occur, the emergency exits are on both sides of the main hall. As a courtesy, please set your phones to silent during the plenary. I hope you have enjoyed this morning's networking breakfast, as this conference is a golden opportunity to network with your peers from all over the world. There will be time allocated for questions at the end, so please leave them till then. A QR code will appear on the screen, and you can use that to send your question. We also would like to remind you that there are 3 Wi-Fi networks, IAE main 1, 2, and 3, and the password is the same as the Wi-Fi name. That was it for the housekeeping, and now, without further ado, let's start our session. Our moderator for this session holds the role of Chief Economic Advisor at the Ministry of Economy and Planning. He is also a faculty member at Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies, as well as an expert at IMF. He worked as a consultant in many prestigious organizations in both the public and private sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to stage Raja Almarzoqi. Raja, the floor is yours.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. I'd like to welcome you to this important session about diversification in economy and energy. So this session we will try to discuss both how resource-rich country in the MENA region will be able to diversify their economy, what type of policies that should be recommended, what type of challenge that facing them, why some countries in the globe been able to diversify their economy, and why others not been able to diversify their economy. So such lessons actually need to be drawn from all this experience globally, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of these questions. We have a great panelist with us, try to answer all your questions. Energy, also a big issue, how to diversify away from fossil fuel at the region, how to reduce it, how to reduce the dependency of the region on one source of income and one source of shocks that shocks their economy. Such shocks that with the fluctuations of the oil price, as they heavily depends on oil, causing instability in the economy, and this instability make it a little bit difficult to diversify the economy, which increase the uncertainty and also risk in the region. And the big question, how countries able to reduce this instability and make the economy more in the stable stage of equilibrium as we want to see it as an economist. All these type of questions and answers need to be answered, and hopefully we'll have enough time to cover most of these issues. Would like to invite our colleagues to the panel stage. We have with us Roberta Gatti. Roberta is a chief economist at Middle East and North Africa at World Bank Group. So, Abdulla Al-Abbasi, research fellow at DERASAT. Abdulla. Nouf Alsharif, managing director, research at Jadwa Investment. John Defterios, senior advisor, International Advisory Council member. Fuad Hasanov, Senior Economist, International Monetary Fund. I think, Roberta, we will start with you with your presentation. You have about 20 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Raja, for the kind introduction, and especially thank you to the International Association of Energy Economics and CAPSARC for the kind invitation. It is an honor for me to be here. But I need to make a confession. I'm not an energy economist. I'm just an economist. So what I decided for the presentation today is to take a long-run view of diversification and economic development. And hopefully this will be a useful framework for us to then engage in the conversation that Dr. Raja has outlined for us. Just give me a second to open up this presentation also here in front of me. Very good. And so I will start with how diversification matters for development. I will then move on very briefly to different measures of diversification, and I'm taking this opportunity with you to take a fresh look of the evidence that we have of how economic development and diversification have evolved over the years in the world. I'm working together with colleagues in my office on a paper that tries to update one of the seminal contributions in the literature on diversification, and I will be able to present you some new results, some of which we fully understand, and some of which instead are still to be dug into. And then I'll move on to policies for diversification, and I just wanted to give you a preview. Rather than a list of policies, I'll try to propose a lens through which interpret these policies as they've been adopted in the world for diversification. So I was saying that I'm taking a long-run view of diversification, and this long-run view is very long because I wanted to start with Ricardo. So as all economists in the room here will remember, the comparative advantage theory of Ricardo would predict that as economies open up, they would specialize. And the comparative advantage is also strengthened by newer findings in the literature, and by newer I mean about 50 years ago, that point at the benefits of agglomeration. For example, in papers by Dornbusch, we find that when transport costs reduce, it means that countries are notionally closer to each other, and therefore there are more incentives for concentration of specialization. At the same time, when there are demand externalities, it's more profitable for producers to cluster. And this, again, predicts concentration. So the long-run view is that as you grow, you have incentives to concentrate rather than diversify. But something very important that Dr. Raja already pointed out, and that we know from the empirics, is that it is very costly to grow as a concentrated economy. So what you see here, under the title of Diversification Reduces Vulnerability to Sector-Specific Shock, is a graph that plots GDP per capita for the past, I guess from 1960 to 2020 is 60 years, for highly resource-rich economies, moderately resource-rich economies, and resource-poor economies. The highly resource-rich economies here are defined as countries that have a comparative advantage from the point of factor endowment in resources. And we measure it, and I'll be happy to discuss it later if that's of interest, as the ratio of net resource exports over the working age population. So this is kind of like thinking about Ricardian theory in a very simple way. You have two factors of endowment. One is resources, the other is people. If you end up being a sort of net exporter of resources, you're considered a resource-rich country. If the share of net resources over the working age population is above the median, you're a highly rich resource economy. And among these, we count many of the GCC countries that we think about a lot in terms of diversification. Lo and behold, the main message of this picture is that you see the GDP plotted in the blue line having big swings up and down. And this is the GDP of highly resource-rich economies. I'm not saying here anything new, but we know that because of super cycles in oil prices and the variability in commodity prices, economies that are highly resource-rich tend to have GDP that swings a lot, tend to have concentrated export that are intensive in resources, and also have fiscal revenues that often vary with oil prices. So on one hand, as countries grow, the tendency to specialize. On the other, is extreme cost of growing as concentrated economy, particularly for resource-rich economies. So what does the evidence say in terms of whether countries concentrate or diversify as they grow? So as it is often common in economics, it's a little bit of both. So the paper by Imms and Vaxiark in 2003 was published on the American Economic Review, and it has become the sort of reference paper for how we interpret the relationship between diversification and economic development. What they find is that a U-shaped pattern, and I'll show it to you in a moment, of diversification in employment and value added, which are two dimensions where we measure economic diversification as a function of GDP per capita. This paper spawned a significant set of new papers that looked at different dimensions of diversification, one of which is fundamental also for GCC countries, is concentration or diversification of export. And lo and behold, what these papers found is that also exports tend to follow a U-shaped pattern. Countries, when they are poor, they progressively diversify, and then after a certain level of income per capita, they reconcentrate again. So it seems that these two forces, one of diversification and the other one of concentration, play out over the whole spectrum of economic development. Now, what I've described to you are positive type of statement. This is what happens when countries grow. But should we make diversification a normative imperative for countries? And said in a less nerdy way, should we make it a policy objective in and of itself? For resource-rich countries, the vulnerability to shock and the variability to GDP is a real issue, and it is very costly to grow that way. There's a further imperative that really puts the nail in the coffin on whether diversification should be a policy objective in and unto itself, and that's the reality of climate change. What you see plotted here are the Brent crude oil prices and natural gas prices over 2020 to 2027. And some people say that we are living through the last super cycle of high oil prices. And what you see is a convergence over time of the price of oil at about $70 per barrel, and similarly for natural gas prices. What is driving this? Many forces. One is that demand for fossil fuels is expected to be changing and reducing to be able to manage climate change and arrive at net zero emissions. So if we take the net zero emissions by 2050 seriously, then for resource-rich countries, diversification becomes a true imperative. Now, let me just glaze through different measures and dimensions of diversification, and you'll see graphs that pertain to the first three: employment, whether it's concentrated or diversified across sectors; value added, which presents some differences depending on whether some industries are more or less capital intensive vis-a-vis employment; and export. And these measures are available for a large number of countries from the UNIDO database and the Comtrade database. They're usually available for manufacturing only, and this is what I will present to you in the data. So with this background, what I wanted to go is, to present a fresh look on the evidence of diversification. And this is what we're doing in this new work that is being conducted in the office that I lead, which is the Middle East and North Africa Chief Economist Office in the World Bank. So we will revisit the finding that IMS and Baxiar had 20 years ago of the relationship between diversification and development. We'll see how that plays out across different measures. And then we'll try to unpack whether this pattern that we see in the data is due to immutable differences across countries, or it's really a prerogative of the development process. And hopefully what I mean by this will become clear in a minute. And finally, we apply this estimation to resource-rich and resource-poor countries. So let's start at the beginning. 20 years ago, the paper by IMS and Baxiar came out and showed this relationship between GDP per capita and concentration of employment. What you see on the y-axis is the Gini coefficient, which we all know is a typically used measure of concentration. So if you go from left to right, you find the countries become progressively richer. So as countries start very poor, let's say at about $3,000 in 1985, cost in dollars per capita, you see the countries are very concentrated with a Gini coefficient of almost 0.6. As they grow richer, they become more diversified. And this is the typical, intuitively, the typical structural transformation that we often talk about when we think about the development process of poor countries that tend to be rich in commodities, but they haven't developed yet manufacturing or a service industry. So at an income midpoint of about $9,000, which in their data corresponded to the income per capita of Ireland in the early 90s, countries start to reconcentrate. But as you can see, this U-shaped pattern is not symmetrical. So there's a lot of diversification to begin with, and then some reconcentration, but not all the way back to very high levels of the Gini coefficient. So this is what I was talking about when I said, what does the evidence say about the relationship between diversification and development? Diversification first increases with development from poor to middle-income countries, and then it increases back again. This is what we knew as of 2003, and this is what I've been working on with my team to update and expand. So here you see 3 U-curves. The first one, and let me see if I can use the, take 2. Let me see if I can use the pointer. So this first curve here, which I'm trying to point at, is the update of the curve that you saw before. We see again the U-shape, but now, instead of the 66 countries that IMS and Baxiar were working on in 34 years, we use 172 countries and 57 years. So this pattern of first diversification and then reconcentration persists. And it persists both for employment, which I'm trying to point at, and value added. It is also there for export, and that's the third graph on the right. But as you can see, the concentration of export is much higher than the one that you see in employment in sectors or in the value added. To some extent, this is a function of how the Gini coefficient works, because there are 650 categories of goods classified in Comtrade for exports, but the average number of products that a country exports is about 300. And so when you have a lot of zeros, you will find that the concentration increases. So this is the first result that we see. We confirm that countries first diversify, and then after a turning point, which now we estimate to be at about $20,000 in constant 1985 dollars in PPP, they then reconcentrate. Now, I was telling you, let me glaze over this one, which sort of points at where some of our country years were, as we have this estimation, which is constructed with a non-parametric methodology. But let me move to this other graph, and you'll say it's the same, almost. And let me try to explain what we were trying to do here. What we were trying to do is try to understand whether this pattern of first diversification and then concentration has to do with immutable characteristics of countries, say, good institution, good governance, good social capital, or whether it is really due to an intrinsic process of development. So let's take only employment. I'm still trying to use the pointer. And look at what we have in the pool data. This is the whole panel, the whole data were put together, and this is the graph that I showed before. The one to the left is the one that I showed before, a U-curve. What we do then is that we divide this variation across countries in two parts. One that is due to immutable country characteristics, what we call the between variation, and one that is due to the process of development over time, what a single country does on average as it gets richer. And that's called the within variation that you see to the right. Lo and behold, this process seems to be more driven by immutable characteristics that are country-specific, such as institution, than to the process of development. As a matter of fact, when countries get richer, they continue to reconcentrate, and that's the estimated within variation that you see here to the right. Now, this might sound all too theoretical, but what does it mean for resource-rich and resource-poor countries? And how should we think about these processes of concentrations and diversification when countries differ in such a distinct way as to be resource-poor and resource-rich? And this is what I'm going to try to show you in the upcoming graph, but I just wanted to remind us of how we define resource-rich countries. First, we consider resources, those that are called point resources. So they are oil, gas, metals. But we don't consider resources, natural resources, something like forestry or agriculture, because the process of developing those resources is different. And then we identify resource-rich countries as countries that, over the whole period of analysis, are net exporters of natural resources, a kind of measure of revealed comparative advantage. So what happens when we split the sample between resource-rich and resource-poor? What you find here is the same graph that we had before, but with two groups of countries, resource-rich with the solid line and resource-poor with the dashed line. So what happens here is that you see that resource-poor countries diversify more when they are in the space of being relatively poor and up to the middle income, and then they reconcentrate significantly after that. Resource-rich countries instead diversify, and they kind of start plateauing a little bit around $10,000 without a further reconcentration. The shape of employment and value added is very similar, but something that we have known from even basic analysis is that export of resource-rich countries are always more concentrated than exports of resource-poor countries. Although we find that hump shape. And by the way, initially I mentioned a few papers in the literature that look at the shape of export concentration over the development path. And what people have found is that diversification over the development path happens primarily on the extensive margin. What does that mean? Is that it happens by producing new products and exporting those new products. Now, I'm not sure that, and this is the part where I told you this is new analysis and we have cracked the code of what happens to diversification. I'm not so sure that we have the whole explanation for why we see such a difference in the patterns of resource-poor countries here who reconcentrate significantly and resource-rich. It could be measurement, and it could be that much of the diversification that happens in the currently high-rich countries happens through services. And the data here are traditionally only about manufacturing. It might also be that there are spurious factors. Countries as the composition of countries as we divide these two samples might be different. And we know that if high income countries are smaller, we know that smaller countries tend to be concentrate is because they need to be more integrated in the global economy. So I leave you with this puzzle, and I'm kind of curious to see if you have ideas to offer for why we see these patterns, which is new in the literature. But I wanted next to move to the question that then will become the object of our discussion in the panel. And that's the idea of policies for diversification. So let me take a step back. In this presentation, I hope that we agree that diversification should be a policy objective in and of itself for countries that are resource-rich, highly concentrated in fossil fuel, also because of the imperative of climate change, and not only because of the implicit cost that the variability and the vulnerability of exposure to oil or gas prices shocks imposes on these countries. But how to think about diversification? I hope that this is a useful framework for you to think about these policies. So why are countries not sufficiently diversified if that is in the overall interest of the country to reduce vulnerability to sectoral shocks? One possible view is that, there is a policy failure. So think about a literature that is a literature of actually macroeconomics and fiscal rules, where scholars have found that governments and politicians systematically interpret temporary windfalls in oil prices or gas prices or commodity prices as permanent. In that case, what do? They tend to be more profligate than they would need to, and to make their fiscal policy pro-cyclical. We all know that it's optimal for fiscal policy to be counter-cyclical, meaning for the government to inject resources in the economy when the economy is doing badly. But this type of policy failure makes politicians do exactly the opposite. And parenthetically, when we look at the data, this is what happens more or less in MENA, although we found that over time the procyclicality of fiscal policies in MENA has decreased. So let's say there is that policy failure. What is a solution to eliminate that failure? It is to establish a fiscal rule and, by consequence, to have a sovereign wealth fund form. And now there are around in, I think, about 25 countries, more or less. Most of them are about oil-based resources, but some countries like Chile have it related to commodity copper prices, to smooth the variation in the economy and allow fiscal policy to inject resources in the economy when the economy does badly, which is when prices of the commodity in which the country has a comparative advantage go down. So that is one policy failure, and that's one rule, which I think is by now well understood in the literature and in the policy arena and applied quite broadly, although establishing a fiscal rule is easier said than done. How to legislate a fiscal rule that is meaningful and is actionable, it's quite, I think, a mix of economics and art. But then there are market failures. There is a paper in the literature which I like a lot, and by somebody who for sure will get the Nobel Prize, Daron Acemoglu, co-author with Fabrizio Zilibotti, who studies diversification along the spectrum of development. And what they find is that they think that to expand into a new good, you need to make like a big investment. They call it like a lumpy investment. And if initial investments are high, what do you need to do? You need to borrow for that investment. But financial markets are not complete, and sometimes there are financial constraints. So what does happen is that poor countries tend not to have those lumpy resources to invest in expand the variety of their goods, and so they tend to diversify too little. And that's a market failure, because it would be optimal for them to diversify to reduce the vulnerability to sector-specific shocks. So what are the responses to something that looks like a market failure? And that's where I think the debate is the most active. Many countries provide direct incentives to the non-resource sector to increase the production in the non-resource sector and diversify. That's what we usually think put under the big umbrella of industrial policy. And there's a whole gamut, and I'm sure that my esteemed colleague and panelists here will touch upon that. One of the big criticisms of industrial policies is that you essentially try to pick winners. And in a world that is uncertain, you don't know whether those sectors that you pick are going to be winners. So an alternative of not picking winners but addressing the constraint would be, let's say the constraint is financial, then you provide a sort of seed funding for new startups. And that's how, among, I don't know, many competing startups, you might end up having a new variety of product or a new product. The third thing that you can do is what I heard being defined as investing in no-regret reforms, which is investing in human capital or investing in governance. Essentially, this type of reforms that are not sector-specific, to, I don't know, picking tourism versus cosmetics or versus, I don't know, manufacturing of clothes. They address market failures in the economy. We always talk about underinvestment in education, but they do so in a flexible way, in a way that changes progressively the endowment of country. So imagine the country of Saudi Arabia, the country that is hosting us today and that has done so much in thinking and implementing policies for diversification. Saudi Arabia, as it continues to invest in education, will be changing the environment from just having a comparative advantage in resources, in natural resources, to having progressively also a comparative advantage in human capital that will be essential for developing a high-tech industry and to develop innovation at the frontier. So rather than prescriptive ideas about what countries should and should not do, I hope that this framework is useful for us in the discussion in making us think about what type of constraints some policies are trying to tackle and how countries are going about it, and also the risks that are associated with some policies rather than others. But before concluding, I wanted to leave you with one moment of advertisement. And I think that this is the most important crowd to whom I could advertise this work. Starting with May, my office, under the leadership of our Vice President, Farid Belhaj, is starting a project, a research project on diversification and decarbonization. And what we'll do is that we'll have an open call for papers for academia and think tanks for submissions of interesting papers of research that could address some of the questions that we have identified through a process of focus groups, almost, with our country units. So what we did is that we sat with all our colleagues in the World Bank who are mapped to different country groups, the Gulf, the Mashrek, the Maghreb, Egypt and Yemen, and discussed with them what are the most pressing policy questions that we as an institution are facing. This is what came out. And you might not be surprised, given that we work at the World Bank, I work at the World Bank, that one of the most pressing questions is the redistributive aspect of energy policy, energy transition policies. We want to know whether these policies will be win-win, whether they really will ignite growth. Will they really decrease vulnerability to sector-specific shocks? And how will they behave in the space of products? Are they like innovation? Is like research and development? And finally, how do policies that are more flexible, such as, for example, investing in human capital or removing distortions in the labor market, how are they enabling more diversification? So with these questions, and I hope a few answers that I described along the way, I wanted to thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roberta, for this informative presentation. It answers many questions, but also stimulate other many questions. So we'll come back to you on some of these questions. Now I would like to turn to Fuad, as we discuss diversifications, and I noticed also there is sometimes a confusion how to measure diversifications. And some countries, they just use non-oil sector as an indicator that we diversified or not, while the government spending is mostly the driver. Once oil price dropped, regardless how big the size of non-oil sector that heavily depends on government spending, the whole economy affected. I think the IMF already come up with some idea of discussing how to measure it away from this confusion's way. So if you please shed light on it.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you all for coming, and thank you organizers for the invitations. Happy to be here. So to get onto this question, Roberta, you're right. There are different measures of diversification. We saw it here, but if you think about actually what is the most important one, kind of when you think about diversification, especially for natural resource producers, it's really about exports. So I think we did a conference in Kuwait in 2014, right before oil prices collapsed. So we actually had to convince policymakers. No, that was an important topic. I think Dr. Majid was there at the conference with us. And we had a book that came out, Breaking the Oil Spell, in 2016. And there we actually, the chapter we wrote talks about that. If you look at output diversification, for example, countries actually, we compared Bahrain and Singapore. They're very similar. Most economies, it's mostly services. So if you want to look at kind of tradable sector diversification, exports is a good proxy. And when you look at exports, then you see a completely different picture. Bahrain is very much concentrated on oil, refining, and it says manufacturing, but when you dig deeper, it's actually aluminum mostly, so it's metals at the end of the day. And you look at Singapore, it has a lot of other stuff, mostly machinery, electronics, and other types of manufacturing. So export diversification gives you kind of a very nice way to understand whether countries are truly diversified or not.
Thank you. Abdullah, I might jump to connect these questions to what's faced the GCC country to diversify their economy. As Fuad mentions, how sometimes using the export showing that they have not been diversified as should be, although they focused on diversification for a long time ago.
Yeah, actually, Dr. Raja, the point you just mentioned, it's a very critical point in the GCC. When we see the private sector, it's heavily dependent on the governmental expenditure, and that actually shows that how the private sector is not acting sustainable in sustainable way. So to identify this problem specifically, we have to think about the best practice outside the region. Bahrain work in that sector to establish labor fund, Tamkeen. So what we'd like to is to have an investment which is sustainable, which is reflecting in the export side. I always said that the private sector is an expansion of the governmental entities because we will not see any real contribution if the oil price is going down. One of the things also, as you mentioned, it's the concept of diversification. It was in the region since 20 years. And it's a very basic economic concept that if you have a business, you have to diversify your business. You don't have to put all the eggs in one basket. One of the challenges is related to the private sector. The second also challenges, it's the difficulty and fear of change in the infrastructure itself. And always when you see that when there is any change in the cabinet or change on the policymakers, you will see that all policies and strategies will change with that. So there is no stability in the way we can build upon in the region. The third point, what also I think it's very important, that we have always interrelated between political and economic agendas. And that it's hurting our economy in several aspects. So what we need to do in order to tackle these problems is to decouple the economic and political challenges, and then we start to restructure our political agenda to be more driven by economic objectives and initiatives we need. Actually, being in the Middle East, in the middle of all conflicts, you cannot actually isolate yourself from regional challenges. But I think we are now in very critical time, and we have to think about ourselves. And definitely, if we would like to also to progress very fast, we have to work as a region, not at national or local countries. I think we have so many things similar in the region, and we can build on our differences and also looking for other opportunities in different sectors. Finally, also just to highlight one thing related to energy in that, because if you see, as I mentioned, the problems the problems and challenges are interrelated to each other. If we are talking now, for example, about the solar energy applications and the investment is going in that, if you see it from, there is economic perspective, there is also technical perspective, but most importantly now, and even International Energy Agency warned that China is controlling this manufacture, and somehow they are covering 87% of the whole industry, and their plan is to reach to 96 in 2025. So even the energy transition, it will have political implication on the region. So the call for political restructuring, it's important not just about the oil sector, it's also about energy transition. So we have to have a balanced relationship and to restructure our foreign policy to fulfill our economic targets as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Nouf, as Abdullah mentioned, there is many technical challenges. So I was wondering if you maybe shed light a little bit on the role of R&D for both to solve some of this technical issue and also to help the GCC or the oil producer countries to find a way on creating more innovation and how to be linked to the innovation. So please, if you...
Thank you, Dr. Raja. First of all, I would like to thank the International AAE and the Saudi AAE as well for having this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. Going back to the main focus before going into R&D, Dr. Raja. So as also we saw in the presentation that resource-rich economies actually are identified by a very high constitution of resources. So on average, 60 to 65% of their export revenue, and also from their GDP at about an average of 17 to 19%. So the majority of the resource-rich economies are aspiring to diversify their economies. They're always advised to have a diversified economy to save them, or actually to be less exposed to the vulnerability of commodity shocks, either coming from oil price shocks or resource price shocks, or even from the resource depletion shock. So there are multiple of experiences that have been many resource countries have been through, or even non-resource countries, towards a path for diversification, or in general a development path, let's say an economic development path. But in general, or actually just a top-level policies that have been identified within these experiences are mainly three main or shared policies that have been, or let's say takeaways from these experiences. One of them is to invest in the other types of capital, human capital and infrastructure and utilities, which from this sector or from this investment, you can see that R&D, research and development, would help in actually increasing the productivity in the newly established sectors, And labor productivity is key to be able to lower the costs of establishing these sectors, and also to have these sectors in a more sustainable way to be benefit for the economy in general. Other policies, of course, investing in infrastructure, of course, is key to enable these sectors to find their way into development. Other takeaways is, of course, fixing the policies. A stable monetary policy would help the investments and private sector FDI to flow into the economy in a very stable and growing manner, to help, again, in enlarging the other diversified sectors. And also, the one more policy is to improve the business and the private sector conditions and regulations, also to help SMEs and new investments to fed into these new sectors. But having said this, the most importantly, let's say, from out of this, all of these policies, is to realize that it's a very unique path towards diversification. So there is basically no one-size-fits-all for resource countries. Resource countries could be classified as resource countries as a whole, but they come from different regions, that come from different locations, different size, different demographies in the background. So taking this path with a long-term plan towards diversification, of course, with the continuous help of R&D, would help in achieving the targets.
Thank you. R&D in our region a little bit low, as almost indicated by Nouf. And most of countries in the region, R&D to the GDP less than 1%. The global standard is around 2.5% of the GDP. Country like South Korea, 3.5. Endogenous growth theory, they focus on the role of R&D on the growth. So it might be, as Nouf said, need to be considered as one of the engine for our way to diversify the economy. John, I want to link the diversification to how can the GCC countries, oil producers, help maybe other regions to diversify their energy sector, and this could be one of the ways to increase the investment in non-oil sector through helping others or maybe opening more businesses there. So please shed light on it.
Yes, there's been so much shared, by the way. Roberta, you flagged a couple of things for me to bring up with regards to the role of the sovereign wealth funds, because we see different models, Raja, with the PIF today. I was in Abu Dhabi for 10 years, and you had ADIA as your base load, if you will, on safe investments, and you take a development fund like Mubadala, and your point to R&D, it was looking at different sectors that added value-added jobs, right, for the future. So they went for chip makers like AMD, and then wanted to bring that technology to the bear. Aluminum diversification and consolidation, and then even the aerospace sector with strata manufacturing. So it was interesting methodology in the UAE, because they have the oil revenues and a small population, build that base, and then use a development fund to pick sectors for employment and drive it through R&D. And if I use the Dubai model here in diversification, kind of classically, they followed the Singapore model. An airline base, a trade port with DP World, and then the financial center, which was the Bahrain model originally as well. And then it evolved today as a financial center, a health tech sector, again, with R&D supporting it, and then looking at the metaverse to see where's the next generation of growth, right? So we see them using the oil wealth for diversification, which I think is excellent. I was talking with Adam before I came onto the panel today. I've been coming to the kingdom for 30 years. If you look at the last 5 years, it's nothing short of a revolution, which most people in the West, particularly in Europe and the United States, don't understand. The PIF, though, has this kind of danger because it's so large, and it's picking winners and losers, as you were saying. Roberta wants to pick the winners, and it could be crowding out the private sector, right, which is a danger in itself, right? Because it has such a large role that has to balance out this idea of let's start things up and drive them and then make space for other private sector players. So that's kind of the strategy we see in the GCC. Your question is, how do the GCC players with the oil revenues here try to help the neighbors, right? To your point before, Abdulla, was that they've been handing them cash at different critical intervals over the last 25 years, right? So in the case of Egypt, which is facing another crisis today, that's been the case. Lebanon, they haven't stepped up in this round, and we know the crisis that's there today. Jordan, they've always wanted to have it stable. Those three, though, very interestingly, in terms of employment, basically provide the base load for very good intellectual talent, right? Very well educated, supporting the GCC states, very loyal to the cause, and their remittances provide the stability. I posed that question to Raja on the energy side because it's almost been a revolution in the last decade with Egypt when it comes to the northern Mediterranean, right? And their ability to cut their import fees in half because they were spending all their money on importing oil and gas from the GCC. So it's fantastic that they have the natural gas resources. I think it's extraordinary that the U.S. with Amos Hochstein have worked out this relationship between Lebanon and Israel, even though they aren't politically aligned. They're seeing natural gas as a unifier, so it's excellent if we can get Lebanon into that space. And then if we can help them accelerate the transition in these states. Jordan's 20% of its baseload coming from renewable energy already. Morocco is often not talked about, but 40% of its baseload is coming from the renewable space in solar and wind. We have connectivity that we can talk about later in the panel between Morocco and Spain sharing energy, Egypt coming onto the grid with Greece and Cyprus and bringing energy into Italy. And then finally, because of the energy crisis with Russia, Ukraine, I think it's fascinating to watch how fast Eni or any of Italy has gone into Algeria to double its capacity. It's looking at Lebanon today as a potential play. And strategically, I'd like to talk later in the panel so I don't take too much time. I think as a human race, we aren't very good at medium-term planning. So we built a dependency on Russia with the Nord Stream pipeline. The Eastern Mediterranean, as we found out with Egypt and Israel, offers great potential. We're now seeing the GCC states, to your point, developing an appetite for international investment. So Qatar taking a stake in the Lebanese field and replacing the Russians there. ADNOC International now coming to the fore, looking at investments outside. Mubadala, the development fund I talked about before, took a stake in Israel. So I think they can help accelerate more natural gas resources. They can help invest in the transition, which they're doing already. And later in the panel, I'd love to talk to you about what the GCC states are doing deeper into Africa. So we're even looking at pipelines from Nigeria, as you know, into Niger, coming up to the Mediterranean. And I think, again, as a resource, this was very overlooked by the GCC. And my final point on natural resources, I think what the kingdom's doing, as you know, in the mineral space is a revolution. They're trying to unlock $1.3 trillion worth of value. It's a space that Chinese have owned kind of a dominant force. I think it's excellent. They're diversifying into strategic minerals to assist with the energy transition, to the point you raised in the question.
Excellent point. I might add to it, which is really important, as you said, it's an opportunity there.
Yes.
But also it will help to reduce the instability that caused by declining of the economic security in these countries. And as all of you know that any instability in any country, it has a spillover. And the spillover in the Middle East is really strong and fast, as it's sharing the same culture and also neighbors. And it has its own negative impact on a country like Saudi Arabia to diversify their economy, because the uncertainty that mentioned by Abdulla that caused an issue for an investor globally to come to the region, they will measure it and have it in their risk. So this is an important point. I think we need to maybe continue discussions in Africa. I'll come back to you on.
Sure. The only thing I was going to say, Abdulla brought up this point, and Roberta did as well. This is such a critical, challenging window of time because you're having the GCC countries make investments at home in hydrocarbons, right? Because there's still demand for it. I think it was Apicorp that put out this latest report saying it's nearly $900 billion of investment into energy up to 2026, 2027. 70 to 75% of that money is going into natural gas, right?
Yes.
But we don't know the demand scenarios for oil. There's three major ones out there. 80 million by 2040, 60 million by 2040, or 40 million by 2040.
Exactly.
It'll radically change the region which way kind of wins in the pathways, right, going forward. It's hard to bet now, not knowing how it will play out.
Agree. Roberta, I will come back to you with one of your questions related to our discussion, which is basically about what is the consequences for growth from the energy transition, which is related to what we now just mentioned. Please.
So thank you for the question, but let me just start with some reflections on what what I heard from you, because I thought it was very interesting to see how there is a complementarity between investment in science and incentives in the economy. I'm thinking about R&D, which is also, to some extent, something that needs to be subsidized, that you were saying, Raja, because it tends to be under-invested in. They are lumpy costs at the beginning, and not necessarily the profits can be appropriated by if property rights are not well established. And there is the interaction with the economic incentives. And I was thinking about how the science has sort of abated now, the technology has now abated the cost of solar panels, which just 10 years ago were unaffordable and now have become like a very cheap source of energy. As I think about this tension, I was thinking about the role of prices. And Dr. Nouf talked about the business environment and some of these key categories where you want to invest to make that transition. And getting the prices right is probably one of them. And I'm thinking about the subsidies that we have in the MENA region and how important it is to have a purposeful and well thought through strategy to reduce the subsidies in fuel that have distorted so much of use, both for people and for firms, or overuse of fuel. So if I think about the transition and the growth repercussions of the an energy transition, the first step that I would take in the region is really to rethink the role of prices and to let them act up more. Progressively reduce subsidies, even when now oil prices are high, and protect the poor. The strategy in the sort of social contract of the region has been traditionally of providing people and firms with low prices through universal subsidies. But this is not only very costly, and fiscal space in countries that are not the GCC is becoming tighter and tighter, and instead letting prices act up so that the right incentives to be more green already play up, and then accompany these strategies with the protection of the poor through good systems of social protection. So this is how I think it's also important to interject in the conversation around energy the complementary policies that are necessary to make energy policy succeed. Not only succeed for growth, but also succeed, and this is where me being a development practitioner working at the central bank comes in, for shared prosperity and for the poor. So there is a distributional angle here that is very important to take into consideration. Let me conclude the answer to your question on the fact that this distributional angle to some of these reforms has also implication for the political economy of reform and how fast. And Dr. Abdulla and Dr. Noor and John were also referring to this. Let me just take the example of energy subsidies. They have created a sort of entrenched interest and sort of entitlement for some firms and for people that this is what we expect from the government. This has distorted not only their choices, but also creates a constituency for wanting to maintain the subsidies, even if we know that for a green transition and for a sort of productive and inclusive growth path, they're not beneficial. So I think that being very thoughtful about the political economy and the complementary policies that need to go together with energy economics is very important to get to that win-win that we all want.
Thanks. Fuad, going back to the conference you mentioned in Kuwait and the book Falcon, something that been published. And this is bring me back to the question of how to diversify and the export-oriented you mentioned to measure the real diversification of the economy. And as you noticed, most countries, when they want to diversify their economy, either they go to import substitutions or export-oriented. And the good example for import substitutions, South America, Middle East, which is not the successful stories there. While the export-oriented economy, mostly in East Asian country, what type of lessons that you thought it might be need to be drawn from this experience to the region?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's true, if you kind of talk about don't pick winners, the whole phrase came from probably the failures of the 70s. And if you kind of look at what was done at the time, it was pretty much all import substitution policy. So kind of protect the region, protect the country, trade protectionism mostly, and then you let usually one firm monopoly to do all the business inside. So of course, captured market, they make enough profits, but quality is bad, they cannot compete. And then once you have external shock from outside, something happens, the whole thing is dismantled. Right? So that's what we saw in the 70s. And if you look at what East Asia has done, they switched right away to export orientation. I mean, of course, they did protect their companies, but the protection was there only for one purpose, to help them grow so they could compete outside. I mean, from day one, they had to compete outside. So export was like the key parameter of essentially what made East Asian countries successful. Right? And it wasn't just exports of, then the second question is exporting what? And it's the issue of kind of trying to figure out which sectors. And it's like a progression. If you look at what Korea was doing in the 60s, they were trying to build cars, and they were a pretty poor country at the time. Right? It took them 20, 30 years to get there, but they were trying to build it from 60s. The same about ships. Their first ship sank in the harbor when they built it. So they didn't say, oh, too bad, we are not going to do it anymore. They went back and started building it again. So it's the issue of kind of consistency and experimentation that allows you to really progress. And I think the problem is in many places, there is no consistency in terms of policy implementation and so on. So it's all kind of, we're going to do this sector, but then, it doesn't work out, we're going to drop it and move to something else. So I think this is very important, the experimentation and consistency.
Great, thank you. John, can I go back to Africa?
Sure.
Idea that you want to talk about, so please.
Well, it's very interesting because there's a two-pronged priority there, Raja, I think. Number one, and this came up on the discussion briefly on climate, and we have the air conditioning capacity here and the wealth and the energy supply to continue to provide that, if you will, comfort to the population. So that's the benefit of having the oil savings, right? There's some studies that have been done, and I was at a private Middle East energy transition discussion in London, and somebody came up and said, I know you were based in the region for so long. Our modeling shows that there's a real risk for Iraq and Iran because of this inability to keep its population cool, South Asia. And he was doing modeling to 2040 where you have tens of thousands of people dying because of climate change. So it has to be taken as a serious priority. And I think it's extraordinary that the GCC states take so much responsibility for the broader region of Middle East and North Africa. So it's excellent that it's investing in the energy transition for these states. And now I see that, and the point I wanted to make about Africa is that they're venturing further into Africa. So naturally, East Africa is their kind of point of contact because of the trade relations that they've had. But I see now Saudi Aramco exploring opportunities with Nigeria. And then you see Niger finding natural gas as well. And there is some hypocrisy when it comes to Africa, and I brought up this point when I was at the World Economic Forum because I'm an energy fellow with them. The European Union, prior to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, was telling Senegal and Mozambique and Tanzania, we don't want the development banks to be funding hydrocarbons, so we're going to try to steer them only into renewable energy. I understand that sounds very good on paper, but for a continent that's responsible for less than 1% of the carbon bank that we have today, and you have 600 million people on the continent with no access to energy, there's a bit of hypocrisy there to say, let's not get them into natural gas, accelerate that to blue hydrogen and eventually green hydrogen with the renewables that they're bringing on stream, and allow them to grow. Because if you don't allow them to grow and we run into the climate challenge that's coming in the next 20 years, we're going to have a surge of migration into the European Union. So I think sometimes as policymakers, we don't look at the bigger picture and say, first we got to let them grow and have access to wealth and development and develop a middle class. And we need to mitigate climate change. But if we don't do it quickly, the level of migration and the pressure on the Middle East and North Africa, and particularly into the European Union, is going to be very great. So I think we have to take a much more holistic approach to policy. And then after Russia, Ukraine, they went to Senegal and Mozambique and Tanzania. Yes, we'd love to see you develop it, but we want you to export that natural gas into the European Union and rely on renewables for the future. I mean, we have to strike a balance. And I think His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz was saying that in his conversation with Dan Jurgen. We can't flip the switch and go to the transition, but when it comes to Africa, we should let them develop the natural resources, do it as cleanly as possible as well, but be realistic about what they can have in terms of an opportunity for economic growth as well, because they haven't had that opportunity.
I agree there is a really big challenge if you want to just switch very quick, as you just mentioned, and the quote by Prince Abdulaziz, which is costly for the economy, for the whole global economy, not even specific countries, which has its own impact in our prosperity and also in the future growth of the global economy.
Absolutely. Thanks.
I have some questions from the floor, so I would like to read some of them. One question mentioned, how can developing countries survive energy diversification without financial support from developed countries? I want to take the answer. Abdulla, tafadhal.
Repeat the question, please.
The question said, how can developing economies survive energy diversification without financial support from developed countries? So,
okay. Yeah, I think the concept of diversification has to be actually explained that it's not just a governmental responsibilities. It's not just on supply side, it's also on demand side. So when we are talking about diversification of the energy, we need also to look to the social dimension of that. So talking about diversifications within developing countries, there are several opportunities for the private sectors and social activities and people to be involved in that. And the most important concept in that is the concept of sustainability. So we are talking about the sustainability. There is a dimensional, economic, and environmental sector. So it's not a responsibility for the government to take care of that. This is one issue. Second issue, there are several programs, and I personally work in programs within European Union for African countries to develop the projects related to solar application, deployment, different water treatment facilities. So there are responsibility for the international or developing countries to take care of, and this is definitely something we have to consider. The third thing also, the developing countries are required to look for opportunities. Transition will also associated with cost, definitely, but the cost it could be think about from strategic perspective that if we have redefine the concept of the cost, that is not just the economic cost, there is also environmental, there is healthcare cost, there are several type of costs. So we have to look to the solution, which is, as mentioned, it's to be holistic and comprehensive, to cover all the things related to. And also, there are several solutions which not required efforts. I mean, when we talk about, even before we talk about diversification, we have to talk about energy efficiency, because there is no meaning to start to have diversification in energy without actually you start to have an energy audit and you increase your efficiency. So you have to also, the responsibility now is to reduce the energy and also to increase the awareness about the environmental challenges. So I think this is something achievable and doable, and we have to invest on that also.
Good. You have something to say?
Yeah, I would just keep it tight, but I think we're, again, moving way too slowly. We're not taking the threat fast enough. We've been debating at the last 3 COPs, will the developed nations be developing a fund? They keep on targeting $100 billion, and it's not being, they thought there was a major breakthrough in Egypt, that we defined what the amount is. I think, again, if you want to help the developing world, certainly create a fund to accelerate that sort of support for the renewable transition. To Roberta's point, just something very quickly, if we look at the models of subsidies for solar PV and then for wind, there was a lot of criticism, again, that the government was trying to pick winners. But one would argue if you did it for 10 years, a decade of it, and then begin to phase out, we should be looking in the same sort of arena for hydrogen as well, because, as you know, the private sector's willing to go into hydrogen, but the price to delivery for the customer is too high. So if we want to really have that transition for whatever color of the rainbow of the hydrogen we want, but say blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, I think there is a role for the government in that space, particularly in the developing world.
Great, thank you. Roberta, any initiative from the World Bank or idea from the World Bank on this side?
A couple of considerations. So clearly, when we think about energy transition and we think about the big picture of climate change, we're talking about the global public good. The World Bank is already committed now to the reduction of greenhouse emissions and to support countries towards sustainable growth. But we're that committed that now there is an internal discussion of whether we need to rethink our goals. As you know by now, we are informed by twin goals of reduction of bringing down extreme poverty to 3% by 2030, which is already compromised by the sort of development losses that we had because of the pandemic and these polyshocks, polycrises that are happening, and increased shared prosperity, which is a goal that speaks more to middle-income countries. So the World Bank is now rethinking whether it's important to add a third element of sustainability or explicit and direct target to global public good, of which climate change is one, but prevention of pandemics is the other, to really be able to work in that space as it is becoming more required now. And so to that extent, to that goal, we're rethinking with our operation delivery model, which is now country-based, but to think about how we can complement it and connect it. For example, we're thinking more about regional interventions, and something that John, I think it was John who was talking about, how the Gulf and the Kingdom is acting in a way as a buffer for the shocks that had opposing effects in the MENA region. The oil-importing countries saw decreasing expectations vis-à-vis their macro outlook, and we know that for 2022, the GCC countries registered rates of growth that we hadn't seen for decades. So the World Bank is doing a sort of serious work in thinking about the operation model and also the financing model, because you all talked about the need to sort of step up the financing to being able to allow a fair, sustainable transition to 2025. So that was like from the point of view of the institution. But I was actually struck by something that Fuad said in reflecting on the experience of East Asia. The way I see it in how countries like Malaysia and Indonesia went through their diversification process is that I think they touched upon almost all of the points that Dr. Nouf talked about as the sort of preconditions, the pillars of diversification, some of which were sort of responding to policy failures and some of them were responding to market failures. So they invested more in infrastructure. Some of the countries invested seriously in human capital. And anybody who works in education has learned from what South Korea has done in terms of building an education system that is at the frontier of results. But they also really opened up markets to an export orientation. And that is a market test. So you don't need to kind of evaluate whether these policies were successful because they had a market test. And I was also struck by the importance of the idea of experimentation. So you try different sectors, like placing bets in the economy. But what you want to do is to switch away fast if you think that that bet is not playing out. And in that sense, the market can be cruel, but it's really an engine of creative destruction. And that's where I wanted to go back to the initial point that I was trying to make about prices. Prices are a fundamental signal in the economy for economic agents. And when we mute them with a lot of price controls or subsidies, we don't allow the market to work and to help the creative destruction happen. To conclude here with the concern for the most vulnerable, the markets need to work, but there needs to be a safety net and an insurance for those who fall through the cracks. So, if you were to ask me here what would be a strategy that pays for poverty reduction in this big picture of global public goods, I think that the question of grow, invest, and insure is still there. So markets matter, price signals matter, but we should never forget about those who are the most vulnerable.
I just add something for
or people.
Oh, I'm sorry, Roberta.
Yes, John.
Doctor. Just one thing I was going to add is that sometimes it's patience is a virtue, though, because if you look at the Mubadala model, when they got into the semiconductor market, it was considered a dog. It's like, why is the UAE going to the semiconductor model? And they almost pulled out early. So I saw His Excellency Haldun Mubarak, who's the CEO of Mubadala, and they floated last year the consolidated, chip manufacturing. But because they waited so long and there was so much demand for data and so much demand for chips into mobile phones that they actually won the game. So sometimes the luxury of having the development fund that can look at a trend, make a bet on the trend, and then wait for 10 years is a blessing, which most market forces don't allow, right? So again, that's a GCC blessing of having the baseload of oil revenues, but it's not going to be around forever, too, which is the other point.
Good. Last question from the floor, and I think I have less than a minute. So this is to Nouf. How can local content policies help diversification efforts and achieve their objectives without creating distortions? And the concern usually with the local content, it's become more import substitution, which is against the export-oriented. And with import substitutions, you know how they... So I'd like to shed light within a minute, if you can, please.
Of course. Of course, also taking the points have been mentioned from Roberta and Fuad as well, regarding the types of diversification we're looking at. So if we're looking at import substitution, it's a classic trade policy that has been known for years, which also helps in actually just substituting the foreign goods with local ones. In this case, import substitution would be able to create a new industry in the economy, which is guaranteed by local demand already. So it's a safe sector to get in, which also reduces the costs of uncertainty and visibility for these sectors. So in this case, we can, at this level, just for import substitution, we can achieve an economic-based diversification at first level, which is also reflected in the numbers of the labor market. We can find creating more jobs within this new sector, which helps in identifying or reaching the goal of local or internal let's say, category of diversification. However, in the long run, if this improves to be a successful sector and shows some signs of inclusive growth and development within the country, the sector should be also covering the global and start with regional markets as well. And by this, it will also be reflected in exports, moving from local diversification to external diversification as well, reflected in the number of exports, which is also vital for lowering the vulnerability to any shocks.
Thank you, Nouf. It's really interesting discussions and session. Would like, at the end of it, to thank the organizers for organizing such an important session and have an excellent panelist that helped me to answer most of the questions. I know there is several questions already I received from the floor. We do not have time, but the panelists are already there, so in the break time you have the time to maybe discuss and interact with them. Please help me to thank the panelists.
Thank you very much to our panelists. And ladies and gentlemen, as we said, you can continue the wonderful discussion over coffee. It will be even better. Please be reminded that the concurrent session 7B will be in this main hall. So if you're looking for that session, kindly come back here after you enjoy your coffee. Thank you very much.